Director for the Global Interagency Security Forum. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I have the pleasure and the honor to coordinate today's conversation on the Saving Lives Together framework. And we have a case study, that's Nigeria. Before moving on, maybe we can introduce my co-host, Joachim, from UNDSS New York. I don't know, Joachim, if you want to say good morning from New York.
Yes, just welcome to everybody to that session. I'm the operations officer here in DSS in New York. Currently very busy with Sudan, so I have to maybe go in and out of the session.
Absolutely, Joachim. So yes, so this session couldn't be more pertinent given the situation in Sudan. So UNDSS, the NGO community, is working hard to provide support to colleagues on the ground. I do have a housekeeping slide before we proceed with introducing the great panel that we have put together for today's conversation. Just give it a second to load on your screens. Right, okay, so it's a 60-minute session, so please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. We have a good number of people already registered and joining this call. We're going to record the call, but the only purpose is for taking notes, which we're going to share later on. We hope it's going to be an interactive event, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat box, and my colleague Megan will monitor and make sure that we don't miss any of the questions. You can turn on your camera if you wish, but it's not, obviously, it's not mandatory. You can ask to be unmuted, or you can unmute yourself. And again, my colleague Megan will make sure that things go according to the plan. And if there are any questions, feel free to reach out to Megan or myself. So without any further details, I can start by introducing our great panel for today. We start with Robert Marinovic. Robert, he is the UNDSS Principal Security Advisor in Afghanistan, so normally based in Kabul. He moved there just recently, but before that, he spent 4.5 years with UNDSS as Chief Security Advisor in I guess based in Abuja, and UNDSS representative in Nigeria. Before that, he was a deputy chief security advisor in Syria. So you have like a long career, Robert. It would take like half a day to go through your resume. But well, thanks for joining today. We also have Camilla Corradin. She's the NGO Forum Director in Nigeria. Camilla has been in Nigeria for 2.5 years. She was before the policy advisor for the NGO Forum, and before that, she also worked as a NGO Consortium Advocacy and Comms Manager in Ukraine. Welcome, Camilla, as well. And we have also Daniel. So Daniel, he's the Regional Access and Security Advisor for the International Rescue Committee. And before, he was with INSO Nigeria, so he was a director for a specific geographic area, I believe. So welcome, Daniel. So all three of you have deep knowledge of Nigeria, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be a pretty interesting conversation this afternoon. To set the scene, I'm going to start with Robert. So Robert, if you can just, not everybody is familiar with Nigeria, despite the fact that it's a very mature context from a security risk management perspective. So a lot to be said about the country, a lot of incidents, a lot of attentions the last couple of years. But if you can give us the bird eye context analysis and also walk us through the evolution of the SLT partnership, especially during the 4.5 years that you were leading UNDSS in Nigeria. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Panos. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here to you and Joachim indeed. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever the colleagues are. So I would like just in my 10 minutes that I given for this part, just start with a small note that Everyone is comparing that Nigeria as a giant, but Nigeria actually is a sleeping giant from all dimensions, from the economical dimension, from social dimension, from population dimension, also from security dimension of it. The root of the issues, security issues in Nigeria, a root of all issues, they are multidimensional and multi-layers in different parts of Nigeria, are mainly related to multidimensional poverty. When I was traveling around with my RCDO for 2.5 years, Mr. Eddie Kalon, I told him at one stage on the road movement from Adamawa State down to Abuja, it's not, actually it's not the poverty of the people, it's people are living in the misery. Second one is the governance and the human rights deficit. Third one is the climate change that affected, because one of the roots of the problem up in the Lake Chad Basin, which is not only Nigeria specific, it affects all countries in the region, is related to the climate change that actually occurred back in the 90s of the last century and beginning of this century. Sluggish economical growth vis-a-vis high population growth in Nigeria. A limited involvement of women in civil society and the politics. High youth unemployment and underemployment, and pockets, chronic pockets of the conflict, banditry, criminality, and terrorism driven by ethno-religious differences and the rise in the hate speech in Nigeria. So what we know that so far at these stages, we are speaking more than 90 million of approximately 200 plus million Nigerians living in extreme poverty, of which about 50% are multidimensionally poor. And that's actually a root of all insecurity. After my first month, same colleague Eddie Kalon asked me, Robert, you came here from Syria, so how you see, compare Syria with Nigeria? Actually, I said that I can see the 4 different Syrias in Nigeria. So I will start from the first Syria. First Syria is the northeast, when we're having the as we speak now, still ongoing terrorism activities and active counterinsurgency, how the Nigerian nation or government is calling activities in the northeast of Nigeria. The problem with the Boko Haram phenomenon, how we call it, in the northeast of Nigeria, or Lake Chad Basin region, is actually is not only Nigeria specific, it affects all countries in the Lake Chad Basin region in different scale and scope of it. Also, when we're talking about Boko Haram, for my 4+ years in being in Nigeria, I can see evolution of it. And the Boko Haram that I met first time back in April 2017, and Boko Haram that actually left 2 months ago is not the same. Back in 2017, there was still elements of radical or extreme, or radicalization of extreme religious movement. While when I left Nigeria 2 months ago, actually we can say that the movement has actually transformed to mainly to organized crime activities, not only in Nigeria, but over in the region. Also at the same time, Boko Haram activities, that time in the northeast, were mainly focused on Nigerian territory back in 2017. Now are actually, they are less in Nigeria. We can see more activities on Cameroonian side. We can see more activities on the border between Niger, Nigeria, and Chad, etc., etc. So focus of operation or country-centric operation, indeed, and those remnants of Boko Haram has actually changed and moved to the fringes of the Lake Chad area. In addition to it, there is no need to mention the quite well-developed, lucrative war economy that actually affecting the whole population, the military efforts, the humanitarian response to it, etc., etc. So at the same time, Boko Haram being heavily hit by the military for the last 2 years continuously, we can see that some of those fighters actually moved from northeast, and they moved to some other regions of Nigeria, and they actually joined OCGs, organized criminal groups, in the different parts of Nigeria. So there's the first Syria. Second Syria is a northwest, which traditionally is known by activities of OCGs, and that actually having seasonal changes in the TTPs, what they're conducting, the targets they're doing. They actually, the OCGs are having the interrelation among the different militias. To better understand northwest and north central of Nigeria, I think it's easier to put, instead of talking about OCGs, we can talk about the different militias that are actually organized and controlled by the different warlords. And yeah, there is a lot of illegal business in the northwest Nigeria, and all those, to better understand, if you just put these actually warlords who are in the control of different militias for the more than a decade, we're talking about decades, then maybe we can understand the situation a little bit better. In addition to it, when you're talking about border security, as somebody told me 3 years ago, there is one prerequisite to have a border security in the place, to have a borders in the place per se. So we know that borders in the both sub-regions, sub-Saharan and the Lake Chad regions, actually they don't exist. So it's very easy to have the intensive proliferation of the small arms, drugs, weaponry, ammunition, people, human parts, etc., going from Libya, Mali, Central African Republic, Niger, Nigeria, etc. So it's very lucrative business, and there is that teeny red line between when you're talking about activities of OCGs, not only Nigeria, in the sub-regions, and insurgency or terrorist, etc. So the main TTPs, again, are the kidnapping for the ransom, abduction, attack on civilian population, harassment attacks, illegal checkpoint, etc., etc. And main targets are mainly, and sadly, for the last 2+ years, became actually civilian population. You can just put a little bit spice on it, because some of these activities are also sometimes politically driven by different actors on the ground, especially when we're having election season, and election season in Nigeria, they never cease. That's second Syria. Third Syria is actually active intercommunal conflicts in the central belt of Nigeria, mainly related to the issues between the herders and the farmers, which sometimes becoming actually very often, very frequently, can be very easily manipulated, become religious aspect, and they get ethnic aspect, etc. There was a success from the international community, especially some INGOs and some involvement of UN agencies, like 5+ years ago, to actually suppress this trend. And that trend was with 2000, maybe 16, 17, 18, 19, somehow trend was down, but from 2020 onwards, actually, we can see the peak is going up. Just to compare, 2016, there are more casualties actually resulted from intercommunal clashes in Nigeria than from Boko Haram activities in the northeast. And that trend now, unfortunately, is having a peak. That's the third Syria. The fourth Syria is the rest of Nigeria, including the separatist movements, IPB, in southeast of Nigeria, that was also somehow controlled and not so visible until 2020. Since April 2020 until now, IPOB actually is getting and rising up, and we can see getting also security dimension of it, a political dimension of it, economical impact on the activities in that area, etc., etc. And the rest of Nigeria is not only the rest of Nigeria, but all Nigeria is affected by the criminal activities, going from the petty crime to the cyber crime, piracy on the sea, piracy on the land. In addition to the poor, the safety infrastructure, talking about the roads, talking about railways, talking about the airport security and safety, etc., etc. So this is how actually Nigeria in a 5 minutes or a little bit more actually look like. And putting Nigeria, it's actually sometimes when I describe it, I would like to put to it two issues. For us who are not from this part of the world, there is TIA, this is Africa. So for us who've been in Africa, don't be biased. that we know Africa. There is TIN. This is Nigeria, and to understand Nigeria context, environment is completely different than the rest of the Africa. That's the first part. And the second part to it is that Nigeria looks like when you're peeling the layers of the onion. And I mentioned just a few of them: corruption, economical issue, underemployment, chronic insecurity in the country, etc., to the point that you, at some stage, you're going to start to cry. That's how actually it is. As I said at the beginning of my speech, and Panos just mentioned how actually this situation in Sudan all of a sudden pop up, and Sudan is also a giant in Africa. So Nigeria is a big giant in Africa, and sleeping giant that at some stage maybe can actually wake up also on security portion of it, and we have to be conscious about it. Don't forget it. So this is about security context in the short. How evolution of SLT, implementation of SLT framework was. I sum it up when we have a preparatory meeting for this session a week plus ago. Very simple. If I how to put it on the scale from 1 to 10, how it was in 2017 when it was first time on surge in Maiduguri, and where is now. So 2017 SLT framework was 2. When I left Nigeria, we succeed to reach 8+. Let's put it on this way. What was the reason why it was a 2? And even when I reported to Joachim in the beginning of 2019, when it's mandatory to report to the HQ about implementation of SLT framework, I was very clear to Joachim, sorry, Joachim, I have nothing to report, because actually it doesn't exist. What is the root for it is actually that not only security risk management, dimension of our humanitarian response, purely humanitarian response at that time in northeast of Nigeria, was that we were working the silos. So all those who are having the role in security management with international community that was operating in northeast of Nigeria at that time, we are working the silos. UNDSS security is one silos. UN agency security is second silos. INSO is a security third silos. Those INGOs or other implementing parts who have a security apparatus and structure in the place, they are fourth silos or fifth silos. OCHA civil coordination, another one. The OCHA access, in addition one. Then the different clusters from logistical cluster, etc., purely silos that didn't talk to each other, and that was actually the main issue. Indeed, when you have such a silos, the first thing to do it is to break the silos and put silos together, as much as possible. How to break the silos? Mainly in my case, how I did with the colleagues at that time from INSO, from INGO Forum, from the UN, from OCHA, etc., and acknowledging that everything in life is written by personality. What I did in my case as a leader of UNDS in Nigeria, I changed my staff in the Northeast to make sure that my staff in the Northeast will adapt to the way, to the changes, and to adapt to the new way of doing things. So that was actually the first step to change my staff. I did it. And I coached them, I mentored them to make sure that they set the old values of SLT framework actually will be brought to the surface. Was it easy job? No, it wasn't easy job at all. And Panos mentioned 4 main pillars. I mean, talking about SLT implementation, SLT framework, and we can talk about each of them later on during this session. So that was the first issue to it. Second issue, why it was 0, nothing to report to Joachim at that time, was the fact that SLT framework and focus on SLT framework, all those silos at that time, was only in the Northeast and humanitarian response to the Northeast. And I said again, Nigeria is much bigger than the Northeast. And the people in need, they exist all over Nigeria. So when they tell me about how you implement in Nigeria, I can say how we implement in the Northeast. The challenge is there. But still, as we speak now, we did quite small, a little, when talking about having it in the rest of Nigeria. Bear in mind, we're having different actors in the rest of Nigeria. We're having private sector, we're having the different international organization, etc., etc. So all of this needs to be taken into consideration when trying to evaluate implementation of SLT framework, what challenges were, what outcome was, how we did it, what are the lessons learned, and how we can proceed further. Anyway, now looking back to 2017 from today, I can just say that even though my report to Joachim was very negative in January 2019, I'm proud actually where we actually moved for those 4 years plus, where we are now, and what we left with all those acknowledgements that there's still a lot of to be done. But with Daniel, his predecessor, with Camilla, her predecessors, I think that with all the challenges we had, that actually a lot has been done and a lot has been accomplished. Panos, I will stop it here. I think I use my time, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. This was a very comprehensive analysis, and those of us who don't know Nigeria very well, I think we know a bit more right now. Thanks for that. And I think your last sentence is a great segue to go to Camilla. So Camilla, from an NGO perspective, so given the very complex context in Nigeria as described by Robert, but also like the UN NGO coordination mechanisms a couple of years back, as described again by Robert, and where we are right now, what has been and are the challenges, but also the opportunities from an NGO perspective in terms of like adapting operations and making sure that we have like an optimum security risk management in Nigeria?
Thank you, Panos, and good afternoon, everyone. So on the challenges and the opportunities in the Northeast from an INGO perspective, maybe going back to the context and to also explain a bit more in detail in terms of context, what is the context in which we operate, right? Robert described very well what the dynamics are in terms of the conflict. What does that mean in terms of access and security issues we are facing as NGOs? So as Robert was saying, that the conflict has changed, right? Over the years, the non-state armed groups as they were before are not the same as they are now. But unfortunately, we remain in a context where the operational environment remains very restrictive and limited, and there has been no improvement in terms of access. So in a nutshell, for those who are less familiar with the context here, in the 3 states in which we operate, or where there is a humanitarian coordinated response, Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe, in Borno in particular, we have organizations based in garrison towns and in the capital city mainly, and movement is basically not allowed beyond the garrison towns, meaning that to reach the areas of operations, the only way we have to move is through helicopters. We rely hugely on UNHAS operations, and for most of the roads, there is imposed armed escorts by the military for cargos only, considering that most of the personnel uses helicopters. Why? Because of the security security situation is really complex and does not allow for movement beyond the garrison towns. It's also because there is no, and there has been no engagement with the non-state armed groups to try to have access to the areas that are not under government control or influence of the non-state armed actors. So there's less nowadays compared to probably a couple of years ago, even when I first came to the country. The type of incidents is different, right? So for instance, now before we would have large-scale attacks on garrison towns by the non-state armed groups. Nowadays, we rather have silent infiltrations. It doesn't mean that the organizations or the humanitarian actors are less affected, but it has changed the landscape, right? So the challenges in terms of access, in any case, remain similar. I mentioned the hub, the use of UNHAS, the armed escorts, and also we rely heavily on the many organizations rely on humanitarian hubs in each of those garrison towns, right? As a safe haven in certain cases, as a place of residence in others. So all of this, there is all of this use of shared assets that is happening, a lot of coordination needed around that, and I think this is really, and some of the incidents that happened in the past, and we can say a bit more when we go into the nitty-gritty of the SLT pillars later on, have pushed the conversation about how do we go about it, right? What have the main challenges been so far? I do agree that there has been indeed an improvement in the coordination and a collective commitment to try to operationalize the SLT framework in Nigeria. It's a complex process. It's not an easy one, as also Robert acknowledged. I think there needs to be people who are committed, and everyone needs to find the middle ground between what is actually possible, what the limitations are, but then also how do we work around those limitations of the individual responsibilities of the agencies, the capacity to support when needed, and all of the processes that are needed that sometimes we have struggled, I think, also to put in place for different reasons. In this context in which there is indeed an improvement in the collaboration between the UN and INGOs, which is great. Some challenges remain. I would say that, for instance, there is still a challenge around the inclusion of national organizations, which are our partners, the partners of UN actors, and it is a complex issue, but it needs to be, we will need to reflect upon how do we go about it. And I believe that we're having many discussions now, which are still not finalized, but at regional level or capital level, Maiduguri, Abuja, and it probably requires further systematization in terms at field level as well, right? In the garrison towns themselves, what is the coordination, what are the channels of communication there? Now, another few, very briefly, some other points. Maybe one last point actually, that on capacity building, there's also something that we can explore more jointly in terms of, you know, it's something to reflect on, but there's opportunities to have maybe joint drills, exercises, trainings that also help bring the community together. So something we can also, I think, in Nigeria discuss further going on, to have very concrete joint understanding on how do we go in case we really need to step up the operationalization of the framework. That's it from my side, and back to you, Panos. Thanks.
Great, Camilla. Thank you. It was very useful, and I definitely keep the point about national NGOs, because I would like to go later on back to Robert and seek for his views, ask about his thoughts and how he feels about including some of the national partners in the coordination mechanisms and making sure that information flows around in the most effective way. But before that, I'll go to Camilla. You want to say something?
Yeah. I wanted to add one point. I apologize, I haven't mentioned before, but also I think it was great that Robert gave this picture of the entire Nigeria, right? And particularly so because there's more, and so now we're focusing on the SLT operationalization in the Northeast, which is where there is a coordinated humanitarian response, but those are only 3 states. Now there's more and more needs or an acknowledgement of the needs, more assessments, more understanding of the humanitarian situation also in other states. And at the moment, particularly so in the Northwest, with more and more NGOs and UN agencies establishing a presence and expanding operations, some humanitarian funding, and as a result, activities as well coming in. And I think we will also need to reflect around, okay, without having a presence of OCHA and the coordinated humanitarian response, how do we cooperate, right? Is there, what is the way forward, if there is one? Over.
Great. Thanks, Camilla. Well, and before we go to the core components of the SLT and the 4 pillars we discussed at the beginning of this conversation, I want to go to Daniel. And Daniel, I mean, given the evolution of the critical security incidents in Nigeria, we talked about probably kidnappings or like mass scale attacks a couple of years back, moving to something very different over the last couple of months. What is the type of adaptation from an NGO perspective in terms of like program operations, security risk management? How have you seen the IRC and other agents adapting to the evolving context to manage the existing risk, the previous risks, but also the current risks? So the more like the different version or iteration of what was previously happening.
Thank you, Panos. Well, the adaptations have been diverse. Different organizations have different risk thresholds, and they have reacted differently to the situation. What I can say is that when I started covering the region in 2017, still to mid-2018, there was a very optimistic, and now you can say delusional perspective on what was happening. Most of agencies were perceiving that we were entering a post-conflict scenario, and the type of programming, the type of planning was adapted to that. So there was a lot of even peace building activities, reconciliation, healing wounds, this type of stuff. And this was somehow encouraged by donors. There were political pressure to adopt that view on the events, and it took a while to understand that we were not heading towards a post-conflict scenario, but actually to a massive escalation. And there was a lot of resistance initially to understand these dynamics. NGOs have made contractual commitments. They wanted to deliver at places that in a couple of months they just came under total control of the Islamic State, of one of the 2 factions that are operating. And on the UN side, the message was, we have to rely on the government. The government is in control. The situation will improve soon. There were different steps in the degradation of the context. Initially, there was a heavy push in which some locations that were perfectly accessible, where there was a lot of operations, became directly under control of the Islamic State. Second steps were the roads where you could travel freely. Because of some military developments that we are not going to enter now into detail, started to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 15 informal checkpoints per day. So huge setups in places like Monguno, in places where the feasibility of the road was assumed to have large operations, started to have these issues. There was a lot of stuff in those locations. There were big programs being run, and the only way to get out was a crew of 4 helicopters that could maybe transport 100 people a day maximum for staff that were counted in hundreds in some of these places. At a certain point, when I was working with INSA, we started to send out the message that downscaling operations to under the criteria of essential staff, critical intervention was the most convenient approach. Not all NGOs agreed. Some decided that the risk was too much. They pull out to other locations. Others decided to stay. Up to until 2020, more or less, this was still under discussion. In 2021, where the massive incidents started to happen, and when we started to see the problems that when the risk was imminent, there was no means and no coordination mechanisms in place to evacuate the required number of staff. This led to staff being kidnapped. Because one of the developments that occurred is that on top of the degradation of the security situation, one of the 2 main non-state actors started to develop a type of targeting of humanitarian personnel that I don't think has existed in any other context. It's a specific ideology that has declared any individual vaguely connected with any UN or NGO or something closer to Red Cross humanitarian whatsoever, whether it's a community volunteer or a subcontracted person, that's a legitimate target, and there is a religious duty to harm this on top of other categories of individuals, such as Christians, that some occasions there were abductions in which the identity, the connection with the NGO was not the main factor. It was the fact that this person was a Christian. So one of the things that started to happen is that NGOs started to pull out Christian staff, individuals that couldn't speak local languages, individuals who were dressing in a way that made it very evident that they were not from the area, and massive downscaling of operations. There were some attempts to enhance the helicopter capacity. Some new vehicles were purchased. There were some attempts to improve the hardening the humanitarian hubs that were highly problematic, because the way they had been built, assuming that being close to the government was government position was a good idea, when in fact they was massively targeted, that they were quite weak in terms of contingency measures, no functional hibernation rooms, no security equipment, and a lot of deficiencies that led to serious incidents happening. And another side was the restrictive environment that Camilla has described previously, in which the humanitarian intervention in 2016 followed massive military operations in which rural areas were depopulated. So the army went to multiple locations, villages, finding anyone outside the main towns, pushing them into IDP camps in the garrison towns. And then humanitarians were allowed to enter and operate only within those IDP camps, within those restricted areas. At some point, because of a political disagreement, the state governor of Borno decides that it's time to close the camps and starting sending people back to their villages that were under control, many of them direct control of Islamic State, or under direct influence, a group that was directly targeting any humanitarian that was around. So there's a big divide along political lines between those who would be inclined to please the government, mostly on the development sector, and adopting strategies such as recruiting community volunteers or subcontractors or individuals that are not under the category of staff, and that would develop activities more or less related to the development or stabilization agenda in those areas. And those who consider that this was not ethical, or it was not part of the humanitarian mandate, or it was not something that they wanted to go along with. So many NGOs just pull out from Borno State. They went to Adamawa. They started to work on initiatives such as durable solutions, meaning that refugees from Borno State would go to Adamawa State and they will start a new life there, because the context was much more conducive. But in terms of coordination, I would agree that there was an improvement and more discussion on how to operationalize the Saving Lives Together framework and put everyone to work on the same page, because there were many discrepancies, not only between NGOs and UN, but also between UN agencies on how they were understanding this concept. Over.
Great, Daniel. Thank you. That was very comprehensive. And you touched on coordination, which is actually our next point. So I would like to go through the specifics of the Saving Lives Together framework, and obviously contextualize the conversation to Nigeria. And I'm not sure if we can talk with one voice about the entire country, or given the different hubs, coordination mechanisms would vary depending on which part of Nigeria you operate. And I'll start with Camilla and then go back to Robert. So Camilla, in terms of coordination arrangements, what has worked well, what are the type of improvements, the lessons learned that you capture and you think that are important for us to know, and we can take them to other contexts. So what has worked well in Nigeria? What are like the weaknesses of the system in terms of coordinating with national NGOs, between hubs, within the hubs, with the UN, with the government? Yeah, and it's a multi-layered conversation, I guess. Sorry,
yeah, I think
we only have 20 minutes, so I would ask you if you can be like, if you can take like 2-3 minutes each of you, so we can move through the different components.
Yeah. So very briefly on this, I think there was work done in the past which was a bit set aside and never formalized or validated. So last year, and also as a result, I think, of those big incidents that there were in 2021 in the attacks on Dikwa and Damasak, it took a long time to take lessons from it, but then there was an agreement that we need to understand what is the, how we go about it together. And we started with a workshop with all actors in Maiduguri, which I think was, of course, we're not necessarily agreeing on everything, but I think it was very good to have everyone at the table and discuss what do we need concretely to put on paper. And then from there, the discussion has continued, and we managed to get additional information, for instance, and also some working around some limitations, for instance, on the requests for evacuation flights from UNHAS, right? So because sometimes organizations may have different readings of the situation, and an NGO, we have a situation where one NGO requested for an evacuation flight because they had intel that there were serious risks for the organization and their staff. And UNDSS colleagues had a different reading of the security situation. So in that case, then we went to OCHA and HCRC directly. The organization went, and as the DO, then they validated the evacuation flight. And now we got to the point that, okay, what do we learn from that? That now we have a new process according to which, if it can also be INSO that validates the evacuation flight, meaning that there is a bit more flexibility in understanding what the INGO priorities or ratings, the information they have. And I think this is a very good step forward in understanding that we have different perspectives sometimes, but we are able also to find ways to work through it, right? And I think on that we had a lot of support from HCRC and the UNHAS colleagues as well. And these and all of the work ongoing on the SLT, I mentioned the workshop, and then there's a lot of work still ongoing on that to finalize it. The idea is that it will really help NGOs' decision making, right, in terms of security, and it's not about handing over responsibility of individual agencies, but having all of the elements to take the right decisions around security in terms of what can they request, what can they not, what is accessible. So in a nutshell, I think this is, and yeah, another point I think is now on the cooperation. I think I bring back the point I made before, that we probably need to do a bit more on the communication trees, and especially at field level. So in the garrison towns where there is presence of different actors, how do we take quick decisions when needed? Over to you.
Thank you, Camilla. Robert, systems-wide, from an organizational perspective, if you can talk about the type of coordination structures for security, risk management, information sharing, things that you put in place in Nigeria during your tenure, it would be great to hear from you. And maybe a quick comment about how do you see the inclusion of national NGOs in these mechanisms, that being for coordination purposes or information sharing, always from a security perspective.
Thank you, Panos. Let me first go from the last one to the first one. I was not aware about that national SEOs or NGOs are not permitted to join, because by the framework, it can be done at the country level. So if somebody approaches us, we got agreement. So maybe we are talking here about lack of understanding what SLT framework is and how it is implemented. And some obstacles actually for people to understand. Panos, we spoke when I told you what I used to, when people come to my office and talking about SLT framework, I used to ask them, could you please tell me how many pages SLT framework has? People, they like to talk about SLT framework without reading it, but quoting it, raising expectations from within their own staff, rising expectation for contractors and the vendors, actually one of the main issues that we have to deal with, and one of the main challenges that we have to overcome, to actually not only talking about limitations, but also to manage expectations, what SLT framework is. Second one, how we did both coordination, info sharing. Indeed, info sharing from very beginning, there is no problem with sharing our reports, we're sharing reports from INGOs sharing with us. Sometimes indeed we have a different understanding of the same incident, the possible impact on the organizations that we are responsible, accountable for, at least UNDSS is. And also we were calling what I established, because when I came, the INGOs or SLT partners, they were not called for the security cell, because from what I'm doing even here now, I just changed it yesterday in Afghanistan. So all SLT partners come to the area or country security cell. They're invited to come. They actually participate in our security briefing, changing of information, changing of the approaches, talking about challenges. When we finish that one, then we're talking about specific UN policies and changes. Then SLT partners are going out, and that's it. That's how we actually did it. The problem was, there are two problems. 2017, UNDSS was banned to come to INSO compound and to INGOs. Banned. Second, I see you, Daniel, but we can talk about that. Second one is that also the issue that, as I said, and I repeated also yesterday when I explained this one, because we have a quiet presence here in Afghanistan of the SLT partners, not only INGOs, not only local NGOs, SCOs, international organization, embassies coming to the security cell, which is completely different story than Nigeria, actually, you know. And that's in Nigeria. I used to problem. I can bring the horse to the water, but I cannot force the horse to drink the water. And this is when we're talking about the horse. Can you imagine you are talking about donkey? Okay, so let me put it on different way. The main approach and main paradigm change that we use is 3 C's: communication, coordination, collaboration with all actors, with single our partners, with INSO, with INGO forum, etc. You cannot coordinate if you don't communicate. You cannot collaborate if you don't coordinate. It's simple like that. And that was my preaching to my staff, and preaching to every time when I meet partners on the same. We have to be aware about limitations. We have to understand what the SLT framework is, and we have to be careful how we manage expectations within the staff. We had a discussion at the UNHA steering committee in December, if I'm not wrong. Camilla, you were present at that one in December. That was one clear example where expectations needs to be actually managed, because if we are not saying our staff, not only Nigeria, globally, what actually we can do, maybe we're giving them wrong perspective, how they can implement their programs, and that's one of the things that we have to be careful. As I said, there is the elephant in the room, and we have to be careful. We have to acknowledge there is elephant and how we're gonna deal with that. So there is still this place for improvement, specific to each of the. Nigeria was a specific, Afghanistan is specific, any other country, Ukraine is specific, Sudan most likely is going to be specific, how to do it and how to implement this SLT framework. It's a great tool, and but again, to understand it and the way how to implement it needs to be widely actually acknowledged by those who are involved into it. Stop here, over to you, Panos.
Thank you, Robert. I'll give the floor to Daniel. And Daniel, obviously, you may have some comments responding to Robert, but again, the idea here is to approach this from an institutional perspective and see like the type of coordination mechanisms put in place where the NGOs, invited in like UN security briefings? Were country directors involved in the humanitarian country teams? Did they have a seat in the SMS system? So again, if you can reflect more like from an institutional perspective rather than going to the specifics of different situations. Yes.
Yeah, well, just to mention that as far as I'm aware, UNDSS was never bound to enter INSO compounds. What happened is that some specific security coordination meetings were not allowing the entrance of UN personnel for one specific reason, which is that some NGOs have UN agencies as donors. Therefore, this was assumed that it could coerce the participants from talking on internal security incidents. It was later accepted that not only UNDSS, but UN has, and I don't remember if OCHA finally participated in the coordination meetings. But from 2017, at least, INSO used to co-deliver with the UNDSS security briefings at the OHCT and the HCT, where INSO has a seat granted. And I believe it is the case until now. And there was always a security briefing session, and security topics were discussed, certainly. Something that I think it's interesting to bring up is that we had a specific tool called the Common Emergency Evacuation Plan that was meant to define roles for the specific purpose of emergency coordination in cases of sudden need of relocating staff out of a location at risk, either before an expected incident or happened, which worked not that well, I have to admit, but it was the only formal document that we had for several years, explaining how the procedure should be in some of these cases that became very relevant later, because there were several cases of emergency evacuations from Monguno, January 2019, Ngala, January 2020, Dikwa, 2021, Damasak, 2021, as well, which were refined with time, because these mechanisms existed on paper but were not really needed until there was this escalation. As far as I can recall, I always received invitations to the security cell and some internal UN security meetings with relevant security focal points from different agencies. The issue that we had was that very often those meetings revolve around internal UN policies, and were not really relevant for NGOs. They would enter into detail of rulings that's not what we were interested in, and therefore it had very little participation. But the doors were open, at least as far as I can recall, and there were many security coordination meetings in which UN agencies were invited and were hosted by INSA, by NGO Forum, and by relevant coordination bodies. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So we only have a couple of minutes, actually 5 minutes left. So I'm going to do one last round of comments between the three of you. I want to take a step back and ask. I'm going to start with Camilla. So it's a question about whether you think security was taken seriously in Nigeria, in the sense that it didn't have a seat on the table. So we know that based on the humanitarian architecture, on an annual basis, we have the HNO, the humanitarian needs overview, and then the HRPs, the humanitarian response plans. If we look into the 2 pages of the SLT framework, actually there's a provision about SLT being discussed in the humanitarian response plans. Maybe have a chapter, or maybe just a paragraph. So the question to you, and then I'll go to Robert, do you feel that it was taken seriously by other agencies, by the DOs, by the system in general? Do you feel like you've been supported enough from a security perspective, and was security discussed and found its space so donors can understand what it means for NGOs and for the UN, and subsequently allocate the necessary financial resources. I'll start with Camilla and I'll go to Robert.
Thanks, Panos. So I think there has been a lot of frustration, maybe on this not being taken seriously enough. I don't believe it's in the HRP itself on the SLT, and we have very limited conversation as a community. For instance, at HCT level, I don't remember, of course they're not anymore, by the way, but there used to be the security updates by UNDSS and INSO, so we don't have that anymore, but we really don't have a discussion on the SLT implementation. So I wouldn't say, but maybe others have different perspectives, that the issue is more in terms of, it's not that much in terms of allocation of financial resources, it's more that we should have the space to have the strategic level discussion, right, beyond the ASMT and other spaces where the discussion is happening. And maybe to add on a positive note, that since recently we've been invited to the ASMT, which I think is a positive process, and thanks to those who work towards that, because we were not joining before, and also that there is this joint, and again it's more operational, right, but the joint SLT WhatsApp group where there's all of the information is being shared with the NGOs. NIP is a co-admin, so we can also include the organizations, the NGOs we want to include. So that's, I think, the INGOs at least. So that's also a positive development on the information sharing. But then the strategic level could be taken more seriously. Over.
Thank you, Camilla. After you, Robert. Again, at the strategic level, and it's not specific to the SLT, but it's about security. Do you feel that you've been supported, again, by the system? So now we're not talking about the UN NGO division, if there is one, but more about, like, as a sector and as a function, feeling supported by the system. It's a question for you, Robert.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I just want to add even what Camilla said. Is not only that we bring it to the. When Matthias came as a new RCA CDO, and there was a long discussion. That's the reason why the security briefing at the country ACT actually been seized, and there was a justification for it, which I actually agreed with. But the other things that I think that we are quite informed in all other aspects. Two issues here. When my USG asked me what is taking the most of my day, the first one is to dealing with fake, fabricated, and false social news on the Twitter, Facebook, etc. Second one is to make sure that our SLT partners are supported. Now, going to the second issue. As you know, during my time in Nigeria, I got three different projects for the donor states. In all three different projects of donor states, but my first justification was benefit of SLT partners from those projects. USAID, FCDO, European Union, etc. So every time when I put it, my first thing is it's number one or number two. First is indeed it's operational one for the benefit of all. But second one also to justify that SLT partners will also benefit from the projects. So that is going to just complement what Camilla already said. I think that UNSMS system in Nigeria was considering SLT, not only during country SMT, not only during the ACT, during UNCT, during donors meeting, during ambassadors meetings, on different ways and different layers of it and dimensions of it. But yes, we cannot just look at it as a purely implementation of SLT, but colleagues who are under SLT framework, how they operate, how to protect them. Daniel mentioned the status of humanitarian hubs in the northeast of Nigeria. Yes, we have to redo it. And we ask for the 8 million for the donors. And one of the justification was also not only for protection of UN staff, because that time only UN staff and the humanitarian hubs were UNDSS LSAs. Mainly it was for our SLT partners. It's actually been proven that they're effective and save the lives of our SLT partners. So I think that looking back, we did a lot. We did a lot. It is actually the success story. With all those gaps that we have, and there is a need, they can be recorded. Actually, they are recorded in my handover notes, that what needs to improve and how we can have to go ahead. So, yes, from my strategic point of view, yes, the SLT partners are always in the focus of different forums that we are discussing within the UN. Not only UNSMS as a country SMT or area SMT, but other forums as well. Over to you.
Thank you, Robert. One closing statement from you, Daniel.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer to that question on whether security has been taken seriously or not, and I think that will be my closing statement. I would say generally yes, to a certain level. The moment you have hit politics, the issue of security has become impolite and unwelcome, because it has put barriers to certain plans that some agencies were absolutely determined to implement based on different considerations that had nothing to do with conflict analysis, that had to do with political arrangements that are too far away from me. As long as you don't reach that level, in which I have found angry, not only bored faces, but angry faces, yes, I would say yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, all three of you. Obviously, time was short. My apologies for not being able to take any questions. It moved so fast and faster than I was anticipating. I'm hoping to have a follow-up conversation in the months to come. Again, thanks for all those who attended the call. Maybe just as we close, to say that the GISF, we undertake together with Humanitarian Outcomes a study on the state of security in the humanitarian world. We have actually Afghanistan, Robert, as one of our case studies, and we're hoping to have one of our senior GISF staff hosted by IRC. What a small world, no? In Afghanistan, we also have Pakistan, Ethiopia, Ukraine, and one more country as part of a global project. As I said, it's together with Humanitarian Outcomes. It's funded by USAID. So I'm hoping that at the end of this project, we should be able also to reflect on the SLT, take lessons learned, good practices, and try to mainstream them and share them among colleagues. Again, thank you very much, everybody, especially the three of you, and my apologies for not having more time to have this conversation. Take care, everybody.